last lecture we talked about the Byzantine reconquest of Africa, and now we come to the final lecture in the course and the question of the end of African Christianity. And I have the question mark, the end of African Christianity, question mark. Is this the end of African Christianity when the Muslims arrive in the 7th century, or is there an end to African Christianity? So we talked about the reconquest under Justinian and the lands that were restored, particularly in the west and across North Africa, restored to the empire by Justinian and his general, Belisarius. And we talked about the fact that these regions, including Carthage and its vicinity, remained Christian until the Muslim conquest. Well, what happens then to Africa with the Muslim conquests? Obviously, the arrival of the Muslim armies across North Africa in the 7th century changes the landscape forever. Lands that had been Christian for a very long time cease to be Christian majority, certainly. Lands that had been under the control of the Roman Empire for a very long time ceased to be under Roman control. In the case of North Africa, particularly Carthage and its vicinity, there's a series of Muslim invasions. So unlike some parts of the empire that were conquered fairly quickly by the Muslim armies, or with one invasion, it actually takes a series of invasions to conquer this part of Africa. So in 697, for example, Carthage falls. 3 years later, Algiers falls, in the capital of modern Algeria. So when I had above the Muslim conquest around 685 to 700, I give a range of dates there because during this 15-year period, or even we could extend it to 20 years, this part of Africa is being conquered over the course of time. But certainly as we approach the year 700 with the fall of Carthage and the fall of Algiers, these are two huge events. And after this, largely the Muslim armies push west all the way to Morocco without nearly as much resistance as they came across trying to conquer Carthage. So what happened to all the Christians? What happened to all the Christians? And if we think about this part of Africa, we might ask this question, but we might especially ask this question if we think about other parts of North Africa that were also conquered by Muslim armies, but that don't have the same story. So what happened to all the Christians in Carthage and its areas? It's often asked in the context of this question: why didn't Christianity survive as it did in Egypt? The situation in Egypt is certainly different from the situation in North Africa in some ways, or is it? The general assumption is Egypt is very different as far as what happens. Yes, the armies come, but much of the population continues to be Christian, and obviously there's a strong history of Christianity in Egypt that goes all the way back to the beginning, that has gone unstopped up to today. There's an unbroken line of tradition in Egypt. There's not an unbroken line of tradition in Carthage. So why? Why did things happen differently in North Africa? Or did they? So first of all, I'm going to present to you the traditional view, the traditional approach to this question of the end of African Christianity. And then I'm going to present to you an updated, more modern view that's questioning some of these assumptions. And that may still give us an end of African Christianity, but it may look very different from what we think of traditionally. So the traditional view has a number of elements to it, a number of assumptions that go into it. And I'm not going to lay out all of them, but I'm going to lay out some of the big ones, some of the big assumptions that go into the traditional view about the fall of African Christianity. One is the idea, and I've mentioned this earlier in this course, is the church possibly too weak from internal fighting? It's not that there wasn't ever any internal fighting within the Egyptian church. Certainly in the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon, there's a lot of controversy in Egypt. But Egypt gets past that. And the traditional view says, well, the Church of Africa has been weakened by the Donatist controversy. Internally, it's weak. It's not as strong internally as the Egyptian church, so it can't stand up under the pressure of the Muslim conquest. It's one part of the traditional view. Another element of the traditional view is that Africa lacked the strong monastic tradition. There's no question that the tradition of monasticism is very, very strong in Egypt. Many, many, many famous monastic fathers come from Egypt. And that, again, is a line of tradition that continues right up to today. So before I came to lecture for this course, I spent 2 days at a 4th century monastery that's been in the desert of Egypt since the 4th century. The idea is Africa maybe lacked that same monastic tradition. And if it lacked some scholars call it the backbone of the Egyptian church, monasticism. If it lacked that backbone, maybe that's what caused African Christianity to end. Or the Vandals. Maybe the Vandals did it. Maybe it was the Vandal invasions and all the uproar and upheaval of these Vandals arriving and destroying churches and threatening the church and overturning things. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the Vandals are ultimately to blame for at least part of this. Or maybe it's the people themselves. Maybe the indigenous people of Africa, maybe the Berbers, these indigenous people, maybe they weren't Christian enough. Maybe they were kind of Christian because of the influence of Carthage and the influence of the Roman Empire, but maybe when it came down to it, the people themselves weren't Christian enough. Unlike, say, the Egyptians, who were really Christian. The people were really Christian. And so they stood up to the Muslim conquest. Maybe the North Africans just weren't Christian enough. These are key elements of the traditional view. And in this view, around the year between 650 and 700, there is the end of African Christianity, such that some archaeologists, when they find epitaphs or funeral inscriptions, there's one collection that has thousands of these epitaphs. Not a single one is dated after the year 650. Why? Because everyone knows after 650 there are hardly any Christians in Africa. Or everyone knows after 700 there aren't any Christians in Africa. Therefore, if you find something Christian, it has to date before that. So it becomes a circular argument. If we assume there were no Christians, then if you find something, it must be earlier. This has been the traditional view. But recently, a number of scholars have been questioning this. And I must say, the first people to question this were not scholars of early Christianity. The initiative taken in question this actually comes from scholars of medieval Islam, who say, you're not describing the world that we know. The description you have of what you think North Africa looked like in the 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, that's actually not the evidence that we have. And this is causing people to re-evaluate some things. So I want to present to you an alternative view. And I'm leaning on the work of a scholar named Mark Handley. He's not the only one who's worked on this, but he's written a particular article called Disputing the End of African Christianity. It's a very good article, in my opinion, of summarizing the basic points of the traditional view, and then of presenting an alternative and a reasoned argument for an alternative. So I'm depending heavily on Professor Handley in what I'm going to present to you now, because I think he really presents it clearly and succinctly. So the first thing he does is he talks about each of the points we talked about before, the points of the traditional view, and he shows us evidence over and over and over again of how each of these points is actually doesn't hold up. These points don't hold up. The idea that, for example, that the North African church was too weak. Well, there's lots of evidence that the church survives well after 650. References to the North African bishops and the North African churches by popes in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And not to one church, but to multiple churches. Funerary epitaphs, inscriptions from graves of Christians that date easily into the 11th century. So the idea that Christianity just went away from Africa around 650 or 700 he shows systematically don't hold up to the evidence. The evidence shows they were Christians. Muslim scholars of the Middle Ages have known this. They've known they were Christians because in their sources there are clear references to Christians. He says at one point, it's worth noting that all the above theories, that is, all the theories that make part of the traditional view, and statements have tried to explain a rapid demise of Christianity in North Africa. But none spend any time trying to prove such a demise. So his criticism is, scholars who present the traditional view, they all try to understand, why did Christianity disappear in 700 from Africa? Why did it disappear? Why did it disappear? He says, wait a minute. First, you have to show that it disappeared at all. You have to prove that it disappeared first. Then you can ask the question about why it disappeared. And his point, as we're going to see, is that the evidence shows it didn't disappear. So here are some of the points he presents. Muslim sources refer to Christian populations for another 400 years at least. And there are particular terms that show up for Christians. And there are accounts of kings and princes who have Christian guards as part of their army, part of their military. These Muslim sources refer to the Christians being in Africa, being not just in Carthage, but in the regions of North Africa up till 1100 or later. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, papal records refer to churches in Africa. As late as 1076. Up through 1076, we have references to churches of Carthage or churches of Africa, bishops of Africa. One of the popes, bishops of Rome, on his funerary epitaph, one of the things that he's honored with is that he restored the churches of Africa in the 9th century. There are churches in Africa in the 9th century. We have an account of a pilgrimage to the shrine of Cyprian in the 850s. Now this doesn't tell us anything too dramatic, but it tells us that a Christian pilgrim in the 9th century came in honor of Cyprian. The shrine of Cyprian was still there, and apparently it was still in operation, which certainly suggests that there are still Christians who are still in operation. Christian epitaphs, as I mentioned, from the 11th century. Funerary inscriptions that are clearly for Christians, dating through the 11th century. There's even a reference in, I believe, the years 1192 to the bishop of Carthage. And there's some question about whether there is actually still a bishop in Carthage in 1192. But this is over 400 years. Even these dates take us 400 years after the so-called fall of African Christianity at the time of the Muslim conquest. So at one point in the article, Hanley makes this comment: looking backwards from a flawed image of Islamic North Africa to our own period, that is early Christianity, has caused problems. In other words, people had a misunderstanding of what North Africa looked like in the 8th and 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th centuries. And so with this flawed view, they then looked back and said, well, who's responsible for this? There are no Christians after 700. Whose fault is this? Is this the Donatists' fault? Is this the Vandals' fault? Is this the Byzantines' fault? Is this the Berbers' fault? Whose fault is this? And he says, we started with a false premise. And therefore, we've looked back in history and tried to find who's to blame for the crime, when there's no crime. There is no disappearance. We can't blame the Donatists for the disappearance of the church in 700 because the church did not disappear. We can't blame the Vandals for the disappearance of the church because it didn't disappear. Which causes us to rethink maybe the implications of these debates. What happens with the Vandals? What happens with the Donatists? What happens with the arrival of Islam? Islam does not come and wipe Christianity off the map of North Africa. That's a traditional view. The evidence just says it's not true. Hanley does, however, offer a possible end date for Christianity in Africa. And in this regard, he presents a view that really is in agreement with what many Islamic scholars think is possible. In the 12th century, there's a group that comes from Morocco, the Almohads. This is a militant form of Islam. They come to Africa, to the region of Carthage. They conquer it. They take control in the 12th century. And it certainly appears from the evidence that they engage in a systematic persecution of Christians. This, Hanley suggests, may be the end of African Christianity. It may be the 12th century, with the arrival of a group that's strong enough and dedicated enough to remove the church that African Christianity dies. Now, we're not saying that African Christianity prior to this was as strong as it was in the 4th century. It certainly had been crippled. It certainly had been weakened, but it was still around, perhaps until the arrival of this group in the 12th century. He provides this comment late in his article. It is a fitting irony that while Christian scholars debate whether the Romans, Berbers, Vandals, or Byzantines were to blame for the end of Christianity, for Arabists, the debate is whether the end of African Christianity should be ascribed to the Almohads or not. For those familiar with the later sources, an end of African Christianity in the 7th or 8th century is simply not considered. The idea that Christians disappear from Africa in 700 does not hold up to the sources. So on this count, we can let the Donatists off the hook. We can let the Vandals off the hook. There does seem to be an end to African Christianity, but it may be much later than we've thought or than we've talked about. What is the implication of the Donatist controversy? If, for those who think the ultimate outcome of the Donatist controversy is the church is weakened and therefore the church is destroyed when the Muslims arrive, if that's a narrative that's being told, we need to come back and start again with that narrative. Because the end may not be what we have thought it to be. I want to make just a few final comments and then we can take questions about this. With this program in general, one of the goals from the outset has been to emphasize the long, glorious history of Christianity in Africa. That Christianity is not something that came to Africa from people that look like me. That Christianity came to people who look like me from Africa. Understanding this history, understanding the people we've met along the way, it's part of, I think, my personal history. I look at figures like Cyprian and Tertullian and Augustine and Quodwold Deus and the nameless thousands of Christians who stood up for their faith over the course of these many centuries. And I consider it an honor to call them my brothers and sisters. They are part of my heritage. They are part of the heritage of everyone who calls himself or herself a follower of Christ. And as such, even if we don't know their names, and even if they may live in places we're not familiar with, I think we owe them our honor and our respect and the dignity of taking them seriously. And I appreciate that those of you who are studying this course are taking them seriously. Probably no one here, no one watching this video perhaps, will say, I can draw my lineage directly back to someone who was an African Christian in Carthage in the 4th century. Maybe there's no family lineage, but there's a legacy of faith. And as Christians, we have a new family. These are our fathers. These are our mothers. And I've appreciated the opportunity to travel with you along this course of getting to know some things about them. learning more about them, and perhaps learning more about ourselves. And as you continue with the readings in this course and continue with your study of church history, either in a course or just personally, I hope that maybe you run across references to Cyprian or Tertullian or Perpetua, and you'll have a little more insight into where that fits within church history and why that might matter. Okay, take some questions about this or about any final thoughts. Yes?
Maybe a comment. I find the Christianization of Africa of the past 50 years or so, which has been so fast, very fascinating. And I think for North Africa, the real question should be, why was the Islamization such a slow process? Exactly the opposite of how the question is often posed.
Yeah, so the question is that over the past 50 years, the Christianization of Africa has been so fast. So why was the Islamization, I'm not sure which, of Africa maybe, why did it take so long as it did in the ancient period? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Certainly, we have accounts that it was not easy for Christians once the Muslims arrived. And you'll hear people say, well, but I heard the Muslims treated the Christians really well, and in some cases perhaps, but the fact was, we have evidence of this, many were given a choice. You convert, you die, or you pay a tax. And it seems the tax was maybe 75% of the income. So there was a cost to Christians who maintained their faith. But the speed, does technology have to do with that? Who knows? But the idea that I think I really heard in earlier parts of my academic career, the idea that Islam just swept across North Africa in one big swoop, almost like they did it on kind of a sunny afternoon. That's just not the story. That's not the story.
So the real paradigm for studies should be, in this area, should be, how was the church so resilient?
So the comment is, the real paradigm for this study should be, how is the church so resilient? And I think that's what we see over and over again. And to come back to something I think I said in the first lecture, we can idealize the past and say, oh, I wish we were back in those days. Or we can demonize the present and say, how is the church going to survive this? Think about all the things that we've talked about in this course. Think about all the challenges that the church has faced. The church is still here. The church is still here. Whatever challenges we face, and they may be great, and they may involve our deaths, the church will continue to march on. And Scripture says that when the church gets to the gates of hell, the gates of hell will not stand against it. Other questions? Well, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your participation. It's been a pleasure and honor to be here. And I hope this is very useful to you. And for those of you who are watching the video, wherever you may be, may God bless you. And let's hope that this is useful for you as well in your own studies. God bless you.